Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike.
My name's Kason.
Today we're talking about prequels.
Prequels.
Stories that are made, conceived, and told, but come before something that's already been made. You made Star Wars, and you're like, guess what? I'm going to tell you about what happened before Star Wars, and leads up to it.
I have some thoughts, but
you know what's funny about this is when I was originally thinking about it, I was really drawing a blank for a single example that I thought was good. Did you come up with one fast, or was it hard for you to? I lost you. I will wait a second for him to come back. It was hard for me to think of one off the bat. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't one, because, I gave it more thought. I looked at some lists, and there are a few that I genuinely think are pretty good. There are some technicalities behind some of them that I'll get into in a little bit. But I was thinking about... Okay, you're back. So my question was this hard for you to think of one that you thought was good quickly?
It really was. I was like, you know what? How often? And I have a theory about this whole thing, and we can get into this a little bit later. But if we're just going to jump into it right now, my theory is that the need for a prequel is a failure of storytelling to begin with, right? Like you didn't tell the whole story. You did it. You started at the wrong point. You screwed up. In other words, like you did it wrong. Yeah, as great as the movie could be, as great as Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever, as great as those movies are, maybe they're starting in the middle of something, and the need for a prequel at all, and you should only really make a prequel if you need to. The need for a prequel is born out of the failure to adequately set the story for your movie to begin with. So I don't know if that's right. That was just kind of a thought I had. People would probably argue with me in the comments, and I welcome that. Please tell me why I'm wrong, because that was just kind of a thought that I had. I'm not married to it.
I think there's something to that, right? Because I do think it's also true that a lot of times prequels are made because it's a franchise that has a fan base,
money, right?
Yeah, and they want to make money. So it's not being done out of necessity from a storytelling point of view so much.
For example, with Star Wars, you've got Darth Vader, right? Darth Vader, the character isn't a very round character, right? He is the evil Dark Lord, and he kind of deathbed apologizes for everything, and that's all we really know about him, right? But all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, no. The character was very round. You didn't understand his backstory. There's a reason he's like this. Well, it's like, well, we didn't understand because you didn't tell us. So, whose fault is that? We had this conception of the character, and then they decided to go back and change our conception of that character. You can only go wrong when you do that, because, if you're going to, if you're going to have a story about a character and then try to change everybody's minds later, it's just a lot harder to do.
Well, you're actually walking right into kind of where I think I was going to go with, if you're going to do it, this is the way that I think you should do it, right?
Well, I look forward to hearing this, because I had a hard time thinking of, how do you do this?
Because, again, I don't want to speak... we speak commonly with generalities on the podcast. There are going to be some examples to the contrary, or some outliers or things like that. But I think, generally speaking, when you have a prequel being made, it's for something that was really pretty popular already.
Yeah.
And so people already know the ending of where the prequel story will lead you. Star Wars is a great example. We know Anakin's going to become Darth Vader by the end of the prequel trilogy. We all know that's where it's going before it even starts.
Which I guess is part of why I would argue that the necessity for a prequel is a failure right from the get-go, or it results from a failure. Anyways, it's just okay.
The only case in which I think that this can be done really well, because I did come up with a couple examples of prequels that I think are really quite good, but most of them I think struggle because they focus too much on the plot. I think if people already know where it's going because they've already seen the original thing, it's one, and this is a totally different discussion. If you're walking into this and you never saw the original thing, right? Let's pretend that there's a kid out there who didn't see the original Star Wars when the prequels are coming out. We were kids when they were coming out. And they had never seen the original trilogy, and they just saw the Star Wars prequels first, and they did not know what was going to happen, right? That's a little bit different, I guess, way of looking at it. But I would think, generally speaking, the reason it's being made in the first place is because the original thing was popular. They're trying to like make some money on the franchise, the name of the franchise, the power of that franchise. So most people have already seen the original thing. So you already know where it's going. So if you make that a plot-centered story, there's a lot of tension and there's stakes that will be lost on the viewer because they already know Anakin's going to become Darth Vader anyways, right?
Right.
So I was actually thinking about Godfather, right? I think I'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah, right, neither.
Because it kind of is a prequel, Godfather 2, because there's two like split storylines that you kind of follow his dad when he was young and he was like rising up, and then like following Michael as the downfall of the family. Anyways, like simultaneously you're seeing both things happen. Anyways, but I think that the only way to make it really interesting still, since we already know what's going to happen, is to answer the question why, kind of like what you were getting at earlier. I don't think that it's necessarily indicative of bad storytelling that every character wasn't fully fleshed out and we understood perfectly the reasons why, as long as it's not like your protagonist or something like that. But maybe the antagonist, let's say Darth Vader in his case.
Sure, I mean that sounds
back
fair.
and then if that trilogy was a psychological exploration for how a good person falls and becomes a bad person, and it was just examining like what happens to a person that like makes them do that, and the entire thing is an exploration of the person's life and choice and consequence and these kinds of themes, that's when I think that it can be really good. Even though you know where it's going, you don't know why. And so then when you watch the original thing again, you have a totally different opinion, mindset, whatever, about the character than you did before. And all the choices that they make in the original thing, you go, there's more nuance in it. I understand it better. Like I sympathize now. It changes your viewing of the original. So as long as you stick to that, it being very character focused, and as long as it will then give context to the original that you did not have before and make a rewatching of the original thing more interesting, I think that you have something that can be really good. So, in my opinion, there are two things I don't think do it well. We've mentioned Star Wars. I will mention Crisis Core, which I think is really bad. But two that I think are very good are Metal Gear Solid 3. And this is kind of reboot territory, but I still think it applies. Like, for instance, Star Trek 2009, I don't consider that a prequel to any previous Star Wars movie, because not only do they reboot it with new actors and stuff, but like the story itself is like a time they like go into a new future. It's like it's a branch in time because this one thing changed. It like changes the whole course of history, and it's like a whole new thing. So you don't really know where the story's going, anyways. So it's not retreading old ground until they do the whole stupid like Wrath of Khan halfway remake of the second one. But we're not talking about that today. What I'm what I'm getting at is that I don't really count Star Trek 2009 as a prequel in that sense. But I think that the Planet of the Apes trilogy, the newer
the new
rebooted
ones.
one, I think that still counts. And it very much falls into what I'm talking about. They explore the psychology of Caesar really, really well in a way to where you get like tons of just conflicting feelings about both sides here. The apes that have sort of risen up, and then like the people who are going extinct and everything throughout that trilogy, especially in the second and third movie. The third movie is amazing character work going on in this movie about freaking apes. You know what I mean? Like, I was blown away. That's one of my favorite movies that I've seen in the last decade.
I still don't think I've seen any of them.
Oh my gosh!
I've just seen the trailers. They look freaking real. They look so
first
good.
one is like, it's a solid movie. It's like pretty good.
Yeah.
The second one was like, wow, that was awesome. What a nice step up. And the third one was just like, oh my fetch. Like, dude, so good. Holy balls, it was good.
Wow.
Like an all-time favorite movie for me. It's really, really, really well done. And I guess the dude who directed that is making the new Batman or something like that. But the one that casted the vampire kid in it, forget his name. From Twilight, Robert Pattinson or something.
Pattinson? He's gonna be in Batman.
That dude's going to be Batman.
Can
you believe that?
Well, I don't want to judge him too much based on those movies, which I haven't seen. Actually, have you seen any of the Twilights?
No, I've not.
Yeah, me neither. I kind of want to, just to see what all the fuss was about.
Anyways, so going back to Metal Gear Solid really quick. Metal Gear Solid 3, right? I don't even know how much you know about the Metal Gear story. I've played a lot of the games, and I don't really know that much about them. They're pretty complex stories. But I'll just put it this way. Big Boss is sort of like a villain of the series earlier on. I can't remember because it's been forever since I played Metal Gear Solid 1. But I think he's name dropped as like the guy who like set up the organization that Liquid Snake works for, and like the whole base and the island where they work at and stuff. I know that he was the direct villain of Metal Gear on the NES. Like that game, I know he was like the main dude. I didn't play that game, but that's what I heard. But he was kind of, and then Big Boss makes a return in a big way in Metal Gear Solid 4. You like actually see him at the end of the game. Anyways, so Big Boss is like this villain who ran this group of mercenaries and set up this island, and like runs like this operation from there. And anyways, in Metal Gear Solid 3, you go back to the Cold War. Sorry, I got distracted. Someone said there's a troll in the chat. I don't know what he's talking about. We need to ban somebody.
Yeah, Scurvy. This Scurvy Joker. He's probably already gone, so it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Somebody dropped by for about 5 seconds and then left.
Okay, so in any case, Metal Gear Solid 3 goes back into the Cold War, and you follow the story of this character as his mentor's name is sort of dragged through the dirt, and she's made into this villain by the government and everything, when all along she was like the real hero all the time, and all the crap that he goes through. And you see his like change in mentality, and like his patriotism sort of dies, and he has all of these really strong reasons to feel the way he feels, and it gives you a very different outlook on the character. And so, like, focusing on him, focusing on Naked Snake / Big Boss, his relationship with his mentor boss, the tragedy of that whole thing, gives you some context behind that character that they kind of go into with some other games like a Peace Walker and stuff like that. But that kind of change your outlook on the whole thing. And so to me, it's a very effective prequel because of that. Now I can replay the other Metal Gear games and be like, like I feel like I have a different perspective on what's going on and who it is that I'm up against and stuff like that. So I think that serves as a really effective prequel for that reason. You have any thoughts before we move on?
Now, in terms of, I haven't played Metal Gear Solid 3, so I don't really know anything about that. But I wanted to actually read a couple things from the chat. We've gotten some really good. People are talking about Better Call Saul, like, a lot.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't either. Dang it. Okay, I was hoping we could talk about that a little bit. But they're saying it's a really good character study. It's almost like somebody had also mentioned Silence of the Lambs had a prequel called like Red Dragon, I think. Now, I haven't seen Red Dragon, but the idea that you could have a prequel about something and people don't necessarily know that it's a prequel about that thing necessarily. I think that might be a better way to do it.
I was going to bring that up because, again, I am not a Metal Gear head. So, like, I've played through them all. I think I've played Metal Gear Solid 3 twice or 3 times. But the rest of them I've only played once, and it was years and years and years ago. But if I'm not mistaken, because when I played it, I had that context. My friend told me, play Metal Gear Solid 3 first, then go back and play these other ones. So I knew it was a prequel from the start. But if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure if you really know that when you're playing it. I think that's something they reveal later, that you are playing as Big Boss. But I could be mistaken. I don't know if that's the case or not. But.
Yeah. Well, here's another question: is Captain America the first Captain America movie? Right?
No, I don't think it. I think that the original comics started at that time period, yeah.
Yes, but maybe that's a bad example because I never actually saw that movie. So I'm talking about the second one. I don't know. Some of the Marvel films are not necessarily told in chronological order. Right?
That's true, yes.
Now, you had like Iron Man, and then I don't even know the order of all these movies, but you have a lot of kind of backstory. You have a lot of things going back to retell certain events, right? Like with maybe, I can't really think of a good example because I'm not familiar with the Marvel films, but I'm sure you could. That a lot of the movies, they kind of go back and they tell little bits, right? And I don't know exactly how much of the Marvel films were planned to begin with, but the fact that they're focusing on different characters, people you would consider to maybe be a side character or something like that, and it's like, oh, you get their whole backstory, and then we go back to the main thing with all of the characters and stuff. So,
one thing that I was going to bring up as a problem, and one thing that's hard to avoid, is retconning or changing established stuff when you go back and mess with it. And I think that's something Captain Marvel ended up doing, because Captain Marvel happens like in the 90s. And there's some stuff they do with like Nick Fury as a character there that kind of messes with like what we had known about him or what he had said before. It's the sort of stuff my brother would point out like immediately and be like, this doesn't work because whatever. So that can be a problem for sure when you're telling stuff out of order and you hadn't thought it through. It hadn't been all I think what you're getting at is it hadn't been all outlined to begin with, right? You decided,
not necessarily. I mean, some of it had. It's not clear what had been and what hadn't.
Right. And that's an argument people make all the time about like the Star Wars prequels, right? Because he claims to have outlined episodes 1 through 6 all at the same time, or 1 through 9 even all at the same time, right? Like he had an outline for like the whole thing, and he had the whole story planned out. But at the same time, you're like, I don't think so, because
I
A,
know
B, C,
something
D
tells
thing that
me
contradicts each other when they say this here and they do this here. Because stories evolve.
things
Whether you
evolve.
had like
Exactly, things
a
change.
rough plan, but then
Well,
you thought about it later for 30 years or something. You know what I mean? And so
yeah. This is kind of funny. Riker's Beard just threw out this question. I have a few others I want to read before this, but he said, "Would The Hobbit be considered a prequel of Lord of the Rings, even though the book was written first?" I don't know if I think he's referring to the books here. Is The Hobbit
yeah, the
considered a prequel,
books.
even though it was written first? I would say no. However, in terms of the movies, yes. The way that they made the Hobbit movies, they made them to be prequels to the Lord of the Rings. And I don't like that. That's one of the things I don't like. One of the big reasons I don't like the Hobbit movies. They tried to make them. They did all the crappy things that most prequels do in those movies, even though it shouldn't have been a prequel necessarily. The Bilbo finding the ring was just kind of a small part of the greater story. And anyways, I don't like how much of that stuff that they put in there. The Hobbit wasn't supposed to be like that, and it was never originally written to be a prequel. So
Yeah, agreed.
that's my opinion.
Xeno Chad says, "Dark Pixel considered the prequel to Resonant Arc?" No,
No.
Resonant Arc is the sequel to Dark Pixel, which is the first, but it is not a prequel. Yeah, prequel has got to come after a thing has been made
it
first.
was made later,
but it goes back and tells a story before the thing that's already been made.
Yeah. So C. Krause says, to counter Kaysen's point, I think a good need for a prequel is when a story is rich enough that it has supporting characters we legitimately want to see expounded upon. I think a good prequel is a story that gives an in-depth exploration of a known ending. We know X character ends at Z place, but let's explore that growth. And it's an arc that we can see being interesting enough to support a story. Now, that's more or less what I was referring to when I said a lot of prequels should maybe be about side characters, about people you didn't know very well. I think a story should be able to flesh out a character well enough to where you know who they are. And if you go back to tell a prequel, you don't necessarily need to relearn who that character is again. You should be moving forward from that point. I don't know, just a thought that I have. But in terms of the side characters, clearly they will not always be fleshed out to the extent that they should be for a good story, because they don't need to be in order for the story to still be good. And so in that case, you can take those characters, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Boba Fett, some of those characters, make standalone movies out of them. And it seems like both of those standalone films that are currently planned have been canceled. So, and they would rather do other things. It's part of why a lot of people, I know you didn't like Rogue One very much, Mike.
Nope.
A lot of people did. A lot of people say it's like their favorite other than, the original trilogy. I feel like there may be something to the fact that these weren't characters that we ever see again, ever. And, it just was kind of telling a brief part of a story before the actual, it didn't reference too heavily the original content. It didn't, I don't know. It kind of did its own thing, and it was its own standalone story that kind of works on its own and doesn't really impact the rest of the original trilogy very much.
Yeah, my problems with that movie are not necessarily related to prequelitis. There is an element of it there in that what's going to happen at the end. So, I didn't feel a lot of tension.
Yeah. But that's all prequels are kind of like that.
Yeah.
It's just a fault of the prequel idea.
Only that element of it, I think, was damaged by it being a prequel. But my problem with the movie was more with its pacing and its lack of attention to building any strong character.
Sure.
And mostly just getting us from action piece to action piece to action piece as quickly as possible. And so I don't think it's a bad movie. I think that it's a competently made movie and has some really, really exciting action in it. But I just did not care about any of the people in the movie while I was watching it. I felt no stakes or tension, or I didn't care if they lived or died. I had no emotional attachment to anything that was happening in the movie. So I just felt
you don't
bored.
connect with the characters at all.
Yeah.
In essence, I guess it was just an expanding upon something that was briefly mentioned.
Yeah.
in episode 4, and that was it. And it's like, oh, let's make a whole movie out of it. But the characters clearly weren't like that, and it's not like I want prequels of the characters in Rogue One the way I wanted prequels of the characters in Star Wars. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. So, anyways, I did want to talk a little bit about where I think that prequels can go wrong. And I think a really good example, because I'm replaying through Final Fantasy VII right now. I got the Switch version.
Oh, sick! Nice.
Which has subsequently become my favorite version of the game I've ever played.
Really? Oh, I might.
If only because it's for reasons that you won't like, though. I think.
Great. Okay,
because you can speed it up to times 3. So
okay, I got you.
Things like mastering materia, or getting the right number of kills with a character so that you can maximize their use of their ultimate weapon. Things like that are made much quicker. These are things that I've done in the past and grinded for 300 hours.
Exactly. When you played a game 20 times, I understand that being a wanted feature.
Yes. So I love it for that reason. It makes getting your limit breaks a lot faster. It makes mastering your materia a lot faster. It makes any of the long animations that you can't skip, like the summons, much faster. So I really have enjoyed this playthrough of it because I've been able to skip through certain things quicker, and I'm about 30 hours into the game, and if I had played it on a normal version without that speed up feature, I'd probably be maybe 50 or 60 hours into it almost. So it's sped it up like that much.
Wow.
Because I've done a lot of that sort of stuff. I've mastered tons of material already, and I've unlocked every character's limit break, and so anyways, that's neither here nor there. I'm playing through it, and I got spoilers for Final Fantasy VII if you haven't played it, if you're waiting for the remake and stuff to be your first time playing through that story. Now's a good time to peace out. Thanks for listening so far. Have a good weekend.
See you later.
Anyways, the sequence in Cloud's subconscious where you go in there with Tifa and you explore like his memories. I remember a couple weeks ago, someone in the chat brought up, because we were talking about the way Cloud is portrayed across the compilation, right? And how we don't like it. And something really stood out to me on this playthrough was Cloud's little kid personality. The child version of himself that you work with in that subconscious sequence to like unlock his memories and find out who he really was.
Yeah.
That kid is not timid or shy, or he's very blunt and almost kind of condescending. And there's a certain part where he's sort of like being self-reflective, and he's like, I thought you guys were so dumb, like you're such immature kids and you laughed at every stupid thing. And Tifa's like, well, we were children back then. He's like, I know, I was the one who was weak and I was the one who was stupid. So he's recognizing his weakness, right? So Cloud is weak-minded. That's like a locked part of his character. But I think they took that idea of him being a weak-minded person and they turned him into a timid guy in Crisis Core, where he's like, oh, like, I'm so scared to like speak up and like, but I'm this nice little timid dude. That I think they messed up. I don't think that they really captured, because that kid was like pretty rude almost, I guess. Like, cause what happens is Tifa goes up into the mountain. She's like losing it because her mom had just passed away and she's dealing with the grief of that. And the other kids are following her, and then Cloud goes running off after her and doesn't make it in time. She slips and falls. They both slip and fall off a cliff, and he
Yeah,
just
after
gets
the
scraped
bridge.
knees. She goes into a coma for 7 days, and her father blames Cloud, like, how could you
Yeah,
do
they kind
this?
of
How
blame
could you
him.
bring her to this place? Like, what's wrong with you? And he goes into a bit there talking about how he became like really aggressive. Like, he started
Yeah.
getting in fights with anybody he could, and he wanted to go and join Soldier, and he wanted to prove how strong he was, right?
Right.
Because he felt this internal weakness. But in response to that, generally, what people do is say when their feelings are hurt, right? They're actually feeling pain or insecurity, but what do they respond with, right? Their primary emotion is this like deep sadness or insecurity or something pained, but the secondary emotion rises up to protect that primary emotion, which is anger. So anger comes out and they respond in anger, but what they're really feeling is a lot of
Mm.
pain, right?
Sure,
So
yeah.
this is what happened with Cloud. He was feeling all of this weakness and all this pain. He wanted to hide that weakness. He didn't want to show it. So he became this condescending tough guy in the way he sort of like showed it on his face, which is very much in line with how he acts at the beginning of the game, right? He talks down to people. He's like, I don't care. I'm just here for the money. That it struck me as really profound that was a part of his personality that he developed there as a kid because of that incident and because he had been an outcast among Tifa's group, right? And so,
Right, yeah.
and it feels very natural that the kid would become angry and aggressive and, you know, like hard to get to know because he's protecting himself.
Yeah.
And so he wants to portray himself as being this. Anyways, so messing with established and beloved characters in any sort of, especially a prequel, but like even in the compilation material in general, and showing a side of the character that doesn't feel true to the original is one way to really mess it up. And it's you're treading dangerous waters there. You take a villain as prolific as Darth Vader, and you're going to portray that character the way that they do in the prequel trilogy. Now, I'm not making this criticism. I'm just saying that one of the things I heard a lot from the, you know, people surrounding us in our circles growing up was how annoying Anakin was.
Right.
Not just in Phantom Menace as the little kid. I don't really blame that. He's just a little kid.
He's
But
just a kid. He actually was
the
fine
second movie, like just this
Yeah.
whiny, people had this
there. The
idea
teenager.
of who he was. And you're right. Like, that's why I'm not throwing this as my own criticism at it, but just bringing it up as an example of how a fandom sees a character this way. They all have their interpretation, and Final Fantasy, far and beyond Star Wars, is meant to be interpretive on purpose.
Right.
Like, I was going to do a video last week. I decided against it because it just kind of got away from what we wanted to do with the channel a little bit. It was a little bit too much of a critical look at things.
Yeah.
And people are too hyped on the game right now, I think, to really like internalize what I was wanting to say. So I just decided against it. But I was going to bring up as like the first part of that video to just demonstrate this point, the quote from Tetsuya Nomura when they were making Advent Children. And talking about how you're not going to get all the answers from this. This isn't like a typical Hollywood movie. It's made for the purpose of getting people to talk and try to find the answers.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And that, to me, has been...
And that's Kingdom Hearts.
that has been the entire company's storytelling mantra since the merger with Enix, at least. But I think even before that, I think going back to Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9... they were doing it then too. They were purposefully being a little bit open-ended with the way that they described certain things, so that the fans would go, they would get on and they would discuss certain points of lore. You know, here's my interpretation of it. Here's mine. Here's why I think it's this. Here's why I think this character really felt this way. And the whole purpose of that is essentially word of mouth viral marketing, right? The players are going to talk about it so much that they're going to introduce it to other people.
Right. They
More
will
people,
create the canon ideas amongst themselves as opposed to with the writer.
yeah. And then they release the Ultimanias and try to answer some of those things. But
Sure.
but the point is that this, I was going to say that as a baseline, like this is supposed to be interpretive, right? Like your interpretation and my interpretation are not the same. I have people I really respect who have certain interpretations of the story or points of the story that I strongly disagree with. I just don't think that that's the way it is. But that's done on purpose. It was created that way so that we would discuss and argue and debate and talk about it more. So, anyways, Final Fantasy VII is an interpretive story. It's meant to be that way. So the fact that even like the creators or people who were on the original creative team for the original game saw Cloud the way he's portrayed in Crisis Core and Advent Children and stuff like that is fascinating to me. Because to me, it seems plain and clear that he was not that way, even in the bits where we saw him not having what we got literally into his subconscious. We're speaking to his subconscious mind, and his subconscious mind is telling you he's not that way. He feels weak, but he didn't want to show his weakness, so he never came across that way. He tried to prove how strong he was. Anyways.
I think the more doing a prequel in general, you run that risk. You run the risk of retelling a character in a way that people will not like. And not just that they won't like it because that's how he was, but won't like it because that's not how he was.
Yes.
He wasn't like that.
Yes, that's the point I'm getting at.
Yeah, you just run such a high risk of disappointing everybody. It's know, but you got to get that money, right? The money's just there waiting to be grabbed.
Right. So while I might have seen, I have many problems with the Star Wars prequels, but why it might not have bothered me that that Anakin was an angsty teenager, because that's exactly what he was, and that's what he should be, because he is an angsty teenager. But people see Darth Vader and they're like, they don't want to see Darth Vader as being
they don't like
an angsty teenager once, and so they want to see him. It messes with their perception of the character and what they don't like. And that, like you said, is a risk you're running by telling a prequel story.
Yeah. Like, hey, do you guys want to know what Darth Vader was like as a teenager? Not really, actually. Like, people want to know Darth Vader's backstory, but they don't want to see Darth Vader as an angsty teen who just, the world's so unfair, Like, that's not Darth Vader. And that's one of the problems with Kylo Ren. He kind of comes across that way. He is the angsty teen Darth Vader, and that is everyone's least favorite Darth Vader. So, like, get rid of that. We don't like that. But I like that you mentioned that you aren't, like, super opposed to, because he's an angsty teen. That just happens to be. But that's the type of story that they decided to tell. That's the problem. They wanted to tell the story of Vader as an angsty teen, not the fact that when they told it, Vader is an angsty teen. So it's like a conceptual problem from the beginning, because you've told me in the past many times, which Harry Potter book is your favorite book?
Number 3.
Yeah.
What's that one called?
That was a different
Prisoner
one.
of Azkaban?
Prisoner of Azkaban. Okay, what's your second favorite?
The books? You're talking about the books, right?
Books or movies? I think books. You've told me in the past number 5. I don't know if
you're right. Sorry.
Because
I was thinking movies.
I know. I should have. We didn't prepare this ahead of time. But in the 5th book, most people's least favorite is the 5th, right?
Yeah.
It may not be your very favorite, but it's not your least favorite, because Harry Potter's a teenager and everything gets screwed up, and that's just how it goes. Now, that's not a prequel. It just so happens Harry Potter was not a teenager when the book started and became a teenager as the books went forward.
Yeah.
But like, it's funny that you kind of you would rather have a realistic interpretation of a teenager, if that is who we're talking about, than just kind of like whitewash the whole thing and be like, oh, Harry Potter was just so perfect and always did the right thing, or Darth Vader was always so evil and he always was evil no matter what. He was never a teen who questioned everything.
I think that my experience was also, I think both of us, it was pretty unique in that, this isn't true if you had started reading like when the book actually came out.
Yeah,
I
I
started
didn't.
reading the books because the movies got them popular, so I went and read them. So
Me too.
along the timeline of when I started reading them and when they were released, I was pretty much the same age as Harry Potter, right?
Oh
Like
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I was probably a little bit older than him when I read books 1 and 2. But by the
Right.
time like 3, 4, 5, when I was reading through that, I was 13, 14, 15 years of age
Right.
myself.
Hmm.
So I think that if I were to read that book today, I'm sure that my outlook would be pretty different than it was when I was 15. And I could really relate to the things he was feeling, right? It could, because it could very well be that as a 32-year-old and I go back and look at that now, it's like, dude, Harry, stop being annoying. Like, Fetch,
Right.
get over it. You know what I mean?
The whole world isn't against you, dude. Come on.
But I
Yeah.
don't know because it's just been so long. But yeah, I don't know. I think that. Well, I want to go back to Star Wars real quick. In
Okay.
that, I find it interesting that, and again, this might be something George had been planning, literally outlined and been planning from the beginning, was to tell the story of Anakin Skywalker from a little boy, right? But see, to me, when I watch the original trilogy and Obi-Wan talks about how he met Anakin and how he was this great pilot,
Oh yeah, that's
I
right. Yeah.
assumed he was older already when Obi-Wan Kenobi met him.
Yeah.
I didn't assume he met him as a child. I assumed from that explanation from Alec Guinness in Star Wars 1977 that he met him as a young man,
It's like a 20-year-old
as a
maybe. Yeah.
pilot in the Republic or something like that.
Sure.
And like they became friends rather than like a father and son mentor relationship. He was like older than him obviously, but he described him as like somebody he met, and it seemed like he was already in adulthood. And so when then you go back again, this is me looking at it as an adult when I'm watching Star Wars. When I was a kid, I was so stoked for the Star Wars prequels, and I fetching loved
Actually,
Phantom
me too.
Menace, and I
And
fetching loved
the lightsaber fights are legit, dude. They're really
yeah,
good.
I loved them.
Yeah.
The prequels when I
We
watched
watched
them
them a
growing up,
lot.
I liked them a lot.
Yeah.
So it isn't until I got older that I looked at them differently. But when I watched, because I rewatched them fairly frequently, but that scene in particular, I get an image in my mind of what he's describing, and it's really interesting having seen the prequels and then watching this and listening to the conversation now. I still get a very different idea from Obi-Wan in 1977 Star Wars about his relationship with Obi-Wan than what we get in the prequel movies. They feel like he's not describing the same thing. And there could be a point made, well, he's being purposely a bit deceptive. He's trying not to tell Luke really what happened so much.
Who his father really was or whatever.
Yeah, fine. But it's kind of the same way with the Jedi Order, too. Like, I get the sense watching the originals now that these were like Taolan monks who lived like apart from society in their little Jedi temple on their own planet and sort of just were like peaceful. I didn't get the sense, oh, we were like directly in the center of the freaking entire galactic government, like had a building right there in the middle of it all, where like active and participating in politics and going on missions for these people. Like, that's not the idea I got when I listened to the way that the Jedi are described by Yoda and stuff like that, right? I saw it very differently in my mind. That gives it, so I can, what I'm getting at is I can see how people who were maybe adults when they watched the original Star Wars movies, and then they see these prequel movies coming out, they get really excited, and then they go see them. It's like, what the fetch? This feels so out of whack from like how they talked about it.
Yeah.
I didn't, it could really mess with that. That's the danger. That's the danger of prequels, is if you detail things that were left mysterious and vague and open and they were left for interpretation, people are going to have their interpretation, their version of it. And then when you go back and tell your canonized version of it, they're going to be like, that's so different. And I'm not sure I like that idea. I like my idea better,
Yep. Somebody was asking earlier, is Knights of the Old Republic considered a prequel? And
Yeah, I guess.
I guess so. I mean, I don't know how
Not to the
official.
Skywalker saga, but to the
Yeah.
universe of Star Wars, sure.
Case like maybe the best prequel ever told is the Silmarillion, right? And possibly you could look at that and say, hey, this is how sequels should be told, right? Like if you're going to go back and tell the story, just don't do it halfway, man. Like go back and tell the whole story. If people are interested in your world, like, and this is harder to do in a movie. I totally understand that, but at least in books, you can do that kind of thing. You can detail a lot of this historical stuff, and maybe it works better in a book because you aren't showing it necessarily. People still get to build it in their mind, to more or less, to a greater or lesser degree. And you kind of have a little bit more freedom to do a prequel book as opposed to a prequel movie. And I
Mm,
don't know exactly why, but every time, not every time, but often when you do prequel movies, you end up seeing these characters younger, kind of like this new Han Solo film. There's a certain type of character that these people always become when we do these prequels, right?
yeah.
They're just these like super quick wit, funny, don't care about anything, only, just care about myself kind of stuff. Um, they just become that kind of character anytime we tell like a prequel story. And it typically, I don't know, maybe I'm making a bit too much of a blanket statement here. That's not always the case, but I often see that type of character in people who I feel like should be a little bit more like how they were initially, but we've got to make them seem cool and hip and witty and young and all that stuff.
Yeah. Got some people talking about like the Silmarillion and Knights of the Republic and stuff. So I do want to touch on that real quick. Um, I think that just for the purpose of kind of like the character work we're talking about, that things like the Silmarillion and Knights of the Republic wouldn't necessarily apply because while the Silmarillion, while like having read that will change perhaps some context in terms of like understanding what the elves are talking about, understanding like what the real stakes are here from the out of the hobbit's point of view and more of like the old I don't want to say old, but the Eldar, like the Eldar elves point of view on things can change it on a rewatch or a reread or something like that. But it's not like we're telling the story of Frodo as a boy. You know what I mean? Like that's the kind of prequel we're talking about. The Hobbit, if it had not been written first, would be that.
Well, the Hobbit movies clearly were that.
Are
They
that
were
for the
trying
films?
to be that, and that's why they're
Yeah.
so stupid. That's why you got that line at the end of the third one where freaking elf Thranduil is like, Legolas, go and find a ranger. You don't know his real name, but you have to discover it for yourself or something. It's like, why do you even throw that stuff in? It's because they're trying to make this feel more like a prequel than it actually was supposed to be.
Yeah. That kind of like nonsense, like fan service sort of stuff, just name dropping things to say, remember this thing and remember that thing you liked.
Remember freaking Aragorn? Yeah, dude, we remember Aragorn. Like, if you're gonna do fan service stuff, do it about something a little more subtle. Like, why is it like the main character from the last trilogy? It's
And
so
relevant to the current plot that you're telling. Not don't just name drop it for the sake, you know. Anyways, so yeah,
yeah.
um,
I don't know that we made a ton of headway in this conversation. It's really because now that it's like, okay, well, what even is a prequel, right? And it's like, well, the rules are kind of vague, I guess, on what a prequel is and is not.
well, okay, so because Rob brought it up again, and this is also something I was going to touch on. I
Yeah.
think when we talk about the Silmarillion, we talk about Knights of the Republic, or this idea of a prequel of the Genova's initial descent into the Final Fantasy VII world with the Cetra and the defeat where the Cetra defeat Genova.
Yeah.
These are like extreme ancient days lore kind of like background stuff, right? Stuff that may or may well, it can still directly affect the plot, but not necessarily the characters of the main thing. So like I don't want to say that either. I think you get the point I'm getting at, though. Like, we're talking about people like thousands of years ago.
It needs to at least be like the same characters.
It's
right?
not part of the same arc over here. Like
Sure.
the Skywalker saga, which is episodes 1 through 9. You know, the Star Wars prequels are movies that directly affect those characters in that generation of people, right?
Well, yeah.
Knights of the Old Republic doesn't necessarily have much bearing on Luke Skywalker's life. It does, in the sense that the history shapes the galaxy and the government and the way the Jedi Order is, but like his specific journey, his specific arc is not affected by character from Knights of the Old Republic. You know what I mean? That's what I'm talking about. I don't consider those prequels so much as just lore detail, I guess.
But those are the best ones. So
That's very true.
maybe we hit on something here. You just said it's not part of the same arc, right? Well, you've got your typical character arc, but if you make a prequel, then just slide that arc over, right? Your little arc. And now you've got another arc, right? So you end up with just a more complicated character arc pattern that is, I don't know, depending on how it's being done, I suppose. And this is the funny thing about Star Wars, is that the characters do change, you know, from each trilogy onwards, right? You didn't have Luke, or you didn't, I guess you technically had Luke in episode 8, but screw that. Well, you didn't have Luke, but you had Vader, and then Vader was still kind of there, and then now he's gone for these new ones. But maybe the Emperor is back. Oh no.
No, dude. When I heard that, I was so mad.
Watching it. I'm never gonna watch another Star Wars movie again.
Never again.
If I can actually do that or not. But freaking, like, you know, like, what is Star Wars about? Like, well, you can't really say what it's about anymore because it's changed so much. It's not about a character anymore. There is no single character that is constant from the beginning to the end. But they all just kind of come and go and fade in and fade out in kind of a blur.
You know, I think you've hit on something that to me kind of clarifies my position on this. And that is that the reason why it's so difficult even to do sequels, Final Fantasy VII compilation, the games and movies that come after Final Fantasy VII, just as much as the one that comes before the prequel, is that we had a completed arc.
We did,
the original thing.
More or less.
It was done. It was completed. We had a resolution. It was over. But now we're trying to make a nope. We're gonna draw that arc out again.
I need to like draw this out, like, and then here's another guy, and then here's another guy. And by the end, it's like his character arc looks like this, and it's like, that's really dumb. That's really bad for a story.
Yes, and I think it's hurt the Star Wars sequel trilogy just as it hurt the Star Wars prequel trilogy. So my position on this is, well, it doesn't matter because the whole thing's driven by money. So we have a powerful brand, something beloved, something people are very, very into, and we can maximize profits on this thing by making additional content from that. I think the right thing to do, what we've arrived at, is let's go billion years in the past and have the name of the thing on it, but have it not affect the arc of the established thing already done.
The arc, you 90% of the time you'll screw things up if you touch that arc.
Whereas if it's like, okay, we're going to go back and tell a prequel story, if it's plot centered, I think it's going to mess with the established arc that you have. If it's an extreme character focus, like a character study of a certain person, then it feels more like a patch, an expansion, an additional DLC episode of the original thing, more than it does like this integral, you must have this. You have to know this in order for this thing to make sense. Or in order for this to work, you need this piece of information. I think if it serves only as, okay, let's bring up Final Fantasy VII again, right? Final Fantasy VII, you have a great completed arc there. You understand pretty much all the characters' backstories and why they did what they did and who they are and whatnot. We get all that. We don't necessarily need that clarified But what would be really interesting, and what I thought they were going to do when I first saw my first screenshot in the magazine for Crisis Core, they showed a shot of Sephiroth and Zack fighting. I think it's from the simulation at the very beginning, like the first little like mission where they run through the whole Midgar bombing thing. I don't know how they have a simulation of the Avalanche bombing that has not happened yet. I know that's not what his goal was, but that's the kind of name dropping, the type of like, remember how cool this was they have you on the train, jumping off the train and going through just like in the original with the original music playing. It's just, that is the equivalent of just, remember this thing that was cool? We're back in the same world again. Anyways, it's from there. The screenshot I saw was from that sequence, and it shows Sephiroth and Zack sort of facing off. And I remember my very first reaction to that was, they're doing a background story on Sephiroth. I'm so excited. And that's not at all what it was.
Right.
But to me, that's the only way, unless you do, like Rob has talked about, a Genova ancient history thing that doesn't affect the arc of the current characters. Unless you do that, the only way I think to do a good prequel is do a character study on Sephiroth. How does that dude become that guy? Like, how does he go from being, I don't want to call him a good guy. I don't think he was ever a good dude, because I think they misrepresented him too as being the soft-spoken, nice guy.
Yeah.
I just don't agree with that take on these guys who are essentially mercenaries for a company. That like is what do you call it? Empirical. They go about like taking over territories and like setting up their reactors and just like, you know, what is that called? Not empirical. Colonialist, whatever that is, where you
private company. I mean, I don't know.
I don't know what you call it. And they go around taking over stuff and taking people's lands from them, right? I find it really hard to believe that these hardened soldiers exposed to Mako had like a good sense of justice and morality and honor and those sorts of things, right? That they were able to retain that. Maybe they had some kind of propaganda going on. They don't really show that much, but it's hard for me to believe that they'd have that mindset. I don't think Sephiroth was ever a good dude in that sense. I don't think he was ever shown off being that way, but he at least wasn't like genocidal.
He didn't kill everyone. Yeah.
So how does a person get twisted to that point? We see the trigger event.
Yeah.
In Final Fantasy VII, but what was his life like to where that trigger event like pushed him over the edge? How does a person become that psychotic? You know what I mean? That would have been, I think, an interesting thing. And you see that through the eyes of maybe like the guy who is just under him in Zack, you know, like seeing someone he looked up to.
Yeah.
Or had illusions of grandeur about sort of like fall from grace, so to speak, but maybe he never was in grace to begin with. He had false ideas about the whole thing. That, I think, could have been like a really cool story that would not have messed with any existing arc. But they have so many things they insert and retcon and change in there that ultimately changes the thematic content of FF7, that it's just like, dude, like, why? Why are we introducing all these new characters, Angeal and Genesis? And Genesis was there at the reactor, and what? And a separate Genova project, or not, you had the Genova S and the whatever, the two different scientists. It's just like, there's just all this stuff that like overcomplicates it. And instead of like being an interesting little window into a character that gives you some context for the original game and maybe changes your perspective on a later playthrough, you now have changed literally like freaking tons and tons and tons of concrete detail about the story of the original game. And I think that is a mistake. Like you're saying, messing with the original arc. Don't do that. Don't do that. Just don't
if
do
it
that.
was good. If you need to mess with the original arc to make it better, and this is one of maybe possibly this. Okay, I read this in the chat because I haven't played Metal Gear Solid 3, but some people say, yeah, Metal Gear Solid 3 kind of patches up some of the errors of Metal Gear Solid 2, which was kind of a not great story, right? Now, it's possible that through improper storytelling, you need a prequel in order to explain everything better or correctly in the first place. But if the story was told correctly to begin with, you don't need a prequel. You can still make one if you want. It might be a cool movie or game, but you don't need to do it. You don't need it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? What do you think about the Metal Gear Solid analogy?
I want to clarify because I just know the way people think. Kaysen's not saying that Metal Gear Solid 2 is bad. Kaysen, I don't think he's played Metal Gear Solid 2.
Sorry.
He's referencing the chat, things in the chat where the chat have said Metal Gear Solid 2 had messy storytelling and Metal Gear Solid 3 patched it.
Yes.
I guess it depends on whether you feel like the story needed it, like whether or not, like you're saying, it's a fit. Like this kind of goes back to the point you made at the very freaking beginning.
Why make a
story
need it? You know.
Yeah, if the story needs patching to begin with, if it needs further explanation, it's because you didn't do a good job,
right,
in the original thing.
Would be something that better tells a story that wasn't all that good to begin with, if that makes any sense. Otherwise, the prequel will, if the source material was good, the prequel will almost always not be good because it is completely unnecessary.
Yeah. I think that there is something to be said there, that it's unnecessary, so why are you doing it?
Yeah.
For plot.
And if it's necessary, it means you did something wrong.
Right, for plot. If it's necessary to understand the plot or to fix the plot, you did a bad job to start with.
Good distinction, not character-wise, but plot-wise. Because not every character needs to be fleshed out, like you mentioned before.
But if you do it as a character study,
pretty understandable and fleshed out.
If you do it as a character study, I think it can be really good. And to me, that is why Metal Gear Solid 3 is good. I don't really care about the Metal Gear plot being patched because the thing is freaking wild anyways. It's crazy story. Final Fantasy VII, while there will be some people, I think, that would argue that it's very complicated. Look, Final Fantasy tells some pretty complicated stories. The series later, after 7, that I think are more complex than 7's was. 7, I mean, I'll be the first to admit I had some misconceptions about, I mean, details that aren't necessarily super relevant to feel like you understood it. Is Genova sentient or not? You know what I mean? Is Genova mind controlling Sephiroth? I guess I never really saw it that way, as a sentient being mind controlling Sephiroth, so much as a parasitic life form that he is unknowingly being manipulated by, but not manipulated in the sense that it has a conscious idea of what it wants. It's like, ooh, I'm playing Puppet Master. You're all on my strings. You'll do my bidding. That's not what I thought. I thought of it like there's an instinct inside of people that have Genova cells injected into them, and they're driven to do something, but they're not sure why. I felt that Sephiroth was part of that. He had an instinct to do something to harm the planet that didn't exist before because Genova cells in him. Anyways, it's been clarified that Sephiroth was using that instinct against Cloud and against the other Sephiroth clones, or copies as they're called, right? He was using the whole Genova reunion thing consciously. He was like using the parasite, using it, right? But that's not something that you have to know or has to be totally clear for you to really enjoy the actual like nuts and bolts. I get the plot. I know how we got from A to B. I know why we're here. I know Sephiroth needs to be killed. No confusion on that point, right?
Yeah.
So there are no details in FF7's plot like that where I was like, dude, I'm lost. Like, I have no idea what's going on here. I need further clarification. Let's make another game and clarify that. You know what I mean? I never felt like it was necessary. I think a lot of people felt that way about the ending because they felt like, oh, what happens to the characters, though?
Wow.
But to me, it was like that was never the point. It was the planet at large was saved, and that's what they were trying to fight for the whole time. And so the planet lived on. The people die and they return to the planet. They go back into the life stream, right? And the life stream is what saved the planet in the end. Right. And so everyone's a part of that. Everyone's a part of the life stream. Every living thing on the planet. So the planet survived. Everyone is preserved. Everyone's memories, all of it is preserved in the life stream. I thought it was a beautiful ending. It didn't need more. Anyways.
I agree.
If there's anything else from the chat.
Fate Zero and Fate Stay Night being the sequel, saying that it's way better than Fate Zero. But I've never played those games, so I've seen that a couple times. Sorry, guys. I know nothing about Fate Stay.
Yeah, I haven't heard of it either.
Torna, the prequel of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Torna prequel game of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Do you know what they're talking about? This is Xenochad.
Oh, you're talking about what is it? Torna?
T-O-R, I don't know.
Yeah, Torna. I didn't play it because I hated Xenoblade 2 so much. I'm sorry, guys.
Then let's keep going. A story that can be improved by a prequel is a rich story. Well, I disagree with that, I guess, in general. This is from Melchior Blade 7. A story that needs a prequel in order to be good is just bad. I think that's Kaysen's point, and I agree. Sounds about right, I suppose. Oh, here you go. C. Krause, this is from a long time ago. He mentioned this, but he said, known endings. Maybe we could talk about this just a little bit more before we close up. Knowing the ending, right? Ahead of the prequel. So C. Krause 89 says, no, known endings don't have to be inherently bad. Look at how often Shakespeare or Greek tragedies tell us the ending of the story in the opening chorus. I'm not too familiar with Greek tragedies, I guess. If the journey is done well, it doesn't matter that we know where it goes. But that is another inherent weakness, I would say, in the idea of a prequel, is knowing exactly what happens. Now, this is also, you could also say this is an inherent weakness in a remake or an adaptation of a book or anything like that. In that kind of material, you also know how everything's going to end if you read the source material to begin with, or if you played Final Fantasy VII before the remake. You know how it's going to end. How does that impact the actual art? How does that impact the experience? And in terms of a prequel, like this kid becomes Darth Vader, right? I guess the point of the prequel isn't that he becomes Darth Vader. It's how he becomes Darth Vader. And so in that sense, there is something there to tell, but there is just an inherent weakness lingering above everyone's head. They're just waiting for the moment that he becomes Darth Vader. The whole prequel, they're just waiting for that moment, right?
Yeah.
And it's in the back of their minds the whole time because they know what's going to happen. And I don't know if that is a bad thing or not, but it's there.
I'm actually glad this got brought up because this was one of the questions on Patreon.
Oh,
and I told the guy that I've already talked about this in a previous podcast. If you go back to episode 15, we were talking about what makes great plot twists.
Oh, and
I talked for a little bit about a study done at the University of California, I think, where they tested a group of people who they had revealed the plot twist to ahead of time and had them read the book, and then versus people who read the book without knowing what the twist was. And the results were that the people who knew the twist enjoyed the story a lot more. And I don't know if saying a lot more is a correct summation of the results they found, but that in general, they found people enjoyed the plot more when they knew the twist ahead of time than those who did not. So I think the title of that study was Story Spoilers Don't Spoil Studies. Mm-hmm. And anyways, I think there's a link to it if you go back to the episode 15 podcast. Because that study was brought up by the guy on Patreon. I was like, holy crap, like I know that study. We talked about that a couple months ago. So we have a question here. Couldn't that just mean that the story was poorly told? No, I think that there is There's a lot of things that can go into this. This is why I don't want to use this as a blanket statement to say, yes, knowing the story ahead of time means you'll enjoy it better. I'm not trying to make any claim like that, you know.
These could really take advantage of that. Just tell you beginning what happens.
Well, the trailers, right? Trailers basically like freaking tell you the whole movie these days.
Very good point.
Anyways,
they do.
I don't think it's correct to make the assumption from that study that, you know, just generally speaking, if you know the story's plot twist ahead of time, you'll like it better. I think for someone, I can only speak for myself. For someone like me, there's two parts to this really for me. I'm going to go through something more than once because that's what I do. Like, I don't just take a story in one time and be like, cool, new thing. I usually go through it twice.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people do that. I don't think a lot of people will just go through something twice unless they just loved it, right? But also, the reason why, let's say, Final Fantasy 15 was coming out, and I freaking knew, because it was leaked. The what happens to Luna Freya was leaked, and Noctis and all that. Like, I knew who was going to die and who was going to live before the game came out. And we were trying to moderate those things in comment sections leading up to the game to not spoil it for our viewers. But I knew about it. And a lot of people were like, dude, how are you not so pissed? You were waiting for that game for like 10 years and you know everything. But see, for me, I'm not looking at it just as, oh, I just want like the story to unfold. I like the context. How did we arrive at that plot point and why is it effective? And so I'm constantly like looking at the story from sort of that point of view, that sort of analytical point of view, like, oh, that choice, that hint that they dropped there, you see that's foreshadowing. That's going to come up important later. Keep that in mind. Unless it's Chekhov's gun, then I'll be pissed. But it's not. I don't think that's going to be Chekhov's gun. I think that they just left that there for a reason. So I'm going to put that in the back of my head now, and that's going to be relevant later. Like, I'm picking up on the trail of breadcrumbs that they leave, so that when we arrive at it, it's like, dude, I love the way they executed that. That was awesome.
Because sometimes, especially if it's something you hadn't thought of before, but you realize it kind of before it happens. This is something I do when I watch Korean shows with my wife a lot. I'll be like, oh, I get it. They're going to do this so that this character can be here at this time, so that when this happens, this other thing can work out, and it's going to actually make sense. Holy cow, they're going to pull this off. I can't believe it. Like, that happens to me all the time. And sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong-ish, I guess. But when I'm wrong, I'm usually like, oh, they should have done it that way. It would have been better. But, I always talk out loud when I watch TV shows. Probably not super fun to watch stuff with anymore. But
well, that's actually a good point, because a lot of people do that.
I'm trying to analyze what's happening and how the methods of how it's happening,
Well, a lot of people do that anyways. Even people who aren't necessarily, they don't think they're analyzing it. They're still guessing. Yeah, and that's part of the fun. They all the people who are watching it together are like, they're gonna make their guess about what's gonna happen, and they're doing that based on putting the pieces together, the pattern recognition of like what we've received so far and where they think it's gonna go. Because again, storytelling is about the message, the theme usually. So if you've been around a long time, you've seen a lot of stuff, you've read a lot of stuff, you're kind of getting the idea of where they're going, and you're picking it up as they're, giving it to you. And there is an enjoyment in that. So, but anyways, for me, knowing it ahead of time, I can still enjoy it because I'm still seeing how they arrive there. And to me, like that's where you get the thematic message from. Like, the plot twist isn't the point of the story. Right. You'll lose the shock. You'll lose that part of it. And I agree, that sucks. Like, dang it, like, I'm not going to be shocked by that moment. But for me, the real point is the theme, the message, and you still get that in the context that leads up to the choices, and, oh, that character shouldn't have made that mistake, and that's what led to the death or whatever, like the tragedy happened because character A made this, and this breadcrumb left all. Sorry, I was way ahead of myself in that sentence. they made this, this, and this choice, which led to this consequence, which were all a trail of breadcrumbs left by the storyteller.
Yeah.
And as you pick those up, you arrive at what they're trying to say, what the storyteller's trying to say with the story. And that's what I'm really here for.
Right.
So it's fine. It's not fine. It's unfortunate, but I can still enjoy it. I can still get a lot of value out of the story, even when I know what's going to happen, if that makes sense.
I have a thought. Star Wars Episode 6, it's called Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
What if the Jedi that returns is Anakin, not Luke?
Oh.
Think of that before? They're like, what's the theme of Star Wars? Like in
the
old theme of the original trilogy would be something along the lines of even the worst people can become good. Or they're still kind of good, maybe, possibly.
They have good left in them. It can be
there's
drawn
good
out.
in everybody, something like that. And then the theme of the prequels is even the goodest people, like that little Anakin kid, can become very bad, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of have a reversal of the story arcs, right? And then these new Disney ones, who gives a fetch? I don't really care what they're trying to say. As far as I can tell, they're not trying to say anything in these movies. But like what the author is saying beyond just what is the arc, like what's the theme, and Return of the Jedi was Anakin returning as a Jedi. Ooh, how about that?
There you go. That's some deep
analysis.
Jason AT brings up about breadcrumbs and prequels. Has anyone seen The Dark Crystal on Netflix that's coming out? Or maybe it's something else?
We saw the trailer.
Wait, so he didn't say Crystal? He didn't say that. He said, have you seen Dark on Netflix? Especially seen season 2. Sorry.
I have not seen Dark, no.
I have not seen that. The reason I thought you were saying Dark Crystal was because it is a prequel. The Dark Crystal show that's coming out in August is a prequel to the Dark Crystal. How are they
going to do it, I wonder?
Right.
Yeah.
So anyways, that's why I assumed you were saying that, because we're talking about prequels. But I haven't seen Dark, so I can't comment on it. My bad.
Haven't seen it.
A lot of people saying, watch Dark, it's awesome. I will look it up.
Oh, cool.
And get into it. But no, The Dark Crystal is a prequel to the Dark Crystal movie from 1983 or 4 or whenever it came out.
Yeah.
Looks so sick, dude.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot there. Like Dark Crystal, for what it is, I guess, it has like some really, really deep kind of lore, and there's a big expansive history kind of to what they're doing there. So there's a lot that they could do with this prequel.
But again, everyone knows where it's going. We know how it's going to end. We know the Gelflings are going to be killed off. We know the Skeksis are going to like take over.
Yeah.
Like we know that's going to happen because we know the original story. So
we know
how are they going to build that tension? What are they going to do to make it interesting? That's what I'm most looking forward to seeing.
Are they going to do any CG, or is it all going to be puppets?
Well, they do have some. They do have some, but they've blended it. They've done, which is what you're supposed to do with good CGI work. You blend it with practical effects in such a way to where you can't tell. But there are some shots in that trailer that blew my mind, like where I know that's not a puppet, because I know the puppet could not have been pulled that way and landed and moved that way. But it's animated so well. And I think that they blend it with like the actual like real elements so well that it's beautiful. It looks really, really good. So I'm very excited about it.
Cool. Even though that's not what you guys were talking about.
I'll watch Dark. I'll check it out.
Is Dark in English? That's my question.
Okay, let's get through some community questions here.
Okay.
One comes from Yaka Bean on Patreon. What happened to the sport RPG genre? Back on the GBA, you had Mario Tennis Power Tour and Mario Golf Advanced Tour, which I had a blast playing them. Since the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Switch, there hasn't been much. Golf Story is the only sport RPG out there.
It's really good. Golf Story is phenomenal.
I have that on my wish list on the Switch.
You got to play it, man. It is too good.
Maybe I should play that instead of Final Fantasy VII for the 15th time.
Maybe.
I guess you could include the story mode in NBA 2K and UFC. I'm looking for a game that only focuses on the RPG and story. Dude, I tell you what. That Mario Tennis game on GBA,
Yeah, that was cool.
That was so much fun.
And you could plug it into your N64 controller pack thing or whatever, and you could transfer your character onto your N64 game with like all his stats and stuff. That was cool.
I really, really liked it. That's a good, I mean, it's a good point. I think it's a good genre, or a good, what do you call it? Is sports its own genre? I guess I would say it is. So sports. I'll call sports a genre. RPGs, RPG mechanics and elements being part of the sports genre, I think that's like peanut butter and jelly. I mean, that's like a really good mix. If we were playing a game dev story, that would be one of those where it's like, these make a lot of sense. Like, this game's going to be great. Yeah. This is a good combination, whatever they call it. A great
speaking
combination.
Of, didn't Game Dev Story create a soccer? What's their soccer one?
But it's like soccer management, right? So you're not playing as a player. You're like a manager of a team.
It's true. That may be one to check out, Yaka, but you're not actually playing. You're just like the manager. So that is.
But if you haven't played those Kairosoft games, that's the name of the company. Game Dev Story.
Game Dev Story.
I don't know what it's called. They're all called Story. Something Story. And they have one where you play as like the manager of a soccer team, football team. Anyways, check out that studio. They have a ton of good stuff you probably like a lot.
Dude McGuy's saying regular sports games incorporate these RPG elements when they have career modes with a character creator and all that kind of stuff. It's true, like NBA 2K, and there's a lot of games where you play a game, you play your basketball exhibition game, and depending on how well you did, you can allocate a certain amount of experience points to different attributes that you want to do better at. And you go out and play the next game and you're slightly better than you were, and you slowly build up to become this all-star player, and they do have that in most sports games now. So that may be what replaced it, but there is something different. And the difference is there isn't a story. It's just the games. And that's why Golf Story is so good. Outside of playing golf, there's a whole story of this guy's life. It's like there's all sorts of other elements to it and all sorts of other things going on than just the sport. Whereas in these sports games now, it's just the sports, and then you have your experience points. It would be like playing an RPG with just battles and no actual exploration, story, or towns, or no story. And it's not quite the same thing. So I think I know what Jakobine is saying.
Yeah, that is something I'd like to see. I'd like to see a game where it's a story about a person's life, but like you play, you're a professional athlete.
You're a professional athlete. Or you're an amateur athlete who wants to be a professional.
You be a professional. That's a good point.
You go out and you climb the ranks and you eventually achieve your dreams,
Yeah. I'm on the same page, Jakob. We need to see more of that. That's untapped potential.
Now, there is in Japan, they aren't here, but in Japan, there is a series of games called Inazuma 11, and it's soccer. And you've got the 11, like they're like high school age kids, and it's sort of like a shonen anime, I guess. But they're this really good soccer team, and they learn to work together, and they have all sorts of experiences outside of the sport event. So these games were typically on the DS or 3DS. So if you can find any Inazuma 11 games, those might be what you're looking for, but I don't know. I think there are fan translations out there that you could get it in English. Otherwise, you're going to have to play it in Japanese, which is what I did, and I didn't get very far because it's hard to I don't know. Playing games, reading text in Japanese, it takes me a very long time. So, yeah. But yeah, Inazuma 11, you should check that out.
All right. Our next question comes from Chris Guin. So apparently there's a medieval fantasy live-action role-playing theme park in Pleasant Grove called Evermore.
Yep.
Have you guys ever been there or ever heard of it? I think it's a really interesting concept for environmental storytelling. You go on quests and so forth, talk to characters. Yeah. It sounds like the kind of thing that could both really interest me, and that would really turn me off at the same time. I love the idea of inhabiting a fantasy setting. I hate role playing. What do you all think? Okay, so we're aware of it. I don't know if you've been. I haven't been yet.
I haven't yet either. It's like $50 a ticket. It's actually very expensive.
It depends on the season and the particular show you go to.
Okay.
Because and I actually know a little bit more about this. I think I am going to go probably this season at some point. Chrissy really wants to go, so we'll probably go sometime in the next month or something like that.
Oh, cool.
But she's been to it.
Real good things about it.
She's been to it. And it is a really promising idea. They have been very poorly managed from a financial standpoint. A lot of the actors have complained about, pay and the timing of pay, and there's been threats about the thing being shut down and certain things that weren't finished. The concept is really cool, and what they've built is really impressive. But you're right. Like, I think that there's an awkwardness to trying to get like the average person to role play. So you have the paid actors there who are doing the role playing, and you're just kind of there observing it. But as far as I can tell, they don't really have quests in the sense that you're talking about. Where like, oh, we're gonna go here and complete this and do this, and even as something as basic as a scavenger hunt. It's pretty basic in its current form. I think these are things they have goals to eventually work up to. But I just know that money was a big problem, and there were threats. Christine knows some people who were in the show, who were employees, who were actors.
Yeah, there's actors. Yeah, they hire actors and they stay in character, and it's
So it's a cool concept. I haven't been yet. I will probably go, like I said, in the next couple months and check it out to see what's been expanded on for this season and see if it's any better. But this is actually something that the guy that I work for, Josh, he ran something called FantasyCon. And he had a similar vision, but this was not for something that was supposed to be a theme park that stayed. It was supposed to be able to travel the country and like bring it to you kind of a deal. And, he had a successful opening year, but then his investor like kind of got cold feet and didn't continue with it. But the concept of it is really interesting. I don't know where I'm going with this. I haven't been to Evermore. I like the idea, but I'm with you in that role playing can be really awkward
absolutely.
For the average person attending a place. So you have to try and create quests or things to do or ways to interact without like relying on average Joe guy who's coming through to like take up the role of a character. Yeah. So how
Can
well
I just wear my
works,
t-shirt and jeans, or do I have to like really get into this, And it's like some people just aren't into that.
I'm not sure how it all comes together. I will let you know once I've actually attended myself. Okay.
I haven't been either, so.
Last one. This comes from Chris Kraus on Twitter. Thought exercise for you. You're a lawyer. Make your case for each era of Final Fantasy. Phase 1, which is 1 through 3. Phase 2, which is 4 through 6. Phase 3, which is 7 through 9. Phase 4, 10 through 12. Phase 5, 13 through 15. Oof. You want to make it more complicated, throw in tactics and sequels like 10-2 in their respective phases. Well, this is pretty easy. I won't get too in detail with this, right?
Yeah.
And making a case for it from like a lawyer point of view, I don't know how well I can do that, but I'll do the best I can. I have to go objection when anyone says Phase 5 has merit. Okay, so to me, obviously, the golden era is Phase 3. I think that Phase 2, there would be some who would put that above Phase 3. But I think that if we're talking about reception, we're talking about growth of the franchise, popularity, how many people it affected, how many people even heard about Final Fantasy before Phase 3 versus how many heard about it afterward. It's kind of no contest. I mean, Phase 3 is where it really exploded. And I think for good reason. I think that 7, 8, and 9, but in particular 7 and 9, are two that are consistently held up as pinnacles, top-tier games. And, 4 and 6 and 5 are in that conversation as well. But I think that with the advent of the PlayStation, the new 3D technology, it just came at the right time. It told the right stories.
It did. It told the right stories.
And like that was the best era of Final Fantasy, in my opinion, with Phase 2 very close behind it. I mean, very close. It's not that the quality of the games are by any means like there's no large gaps between them. They're all very solid, but there's something so special about Phase 3, and there's a reason why it was the most popular phase of Final Fantasy. So I'd say Phase 3 number 1, Phase 2 number 2, and then I'll go with Phase 1 as number 3 as the starter. What got it off the ground. The choices that were made there by the creators are the foundation that was set that allowed the success to come, right? The success came basically a decade after the foundation was laid, but without that foundation, without those creators in place, leading those teams, learning from mistakes as they went along, that never would have occurred. So all the groundwork done in Phase 1 is what led to the popularity of Phases 2 and 3, so I'll put Phase 1 as the next most important. Phase 4 to me is the end of that era, the end of Sakaguchi, the merging of Square with Enix, the changing of philosophy of the company. So there's some really good there. There's some signs of things to come that are, I don't know about this. There's a sequel thrown in there for the first time, like a direct sequel, which is an antithesis to the philosophy of the original creator. He never wanted direct sequels. So we start to see Yoichi Wada's hand in things in this phase, but we have a really strong Final Fantasy X in there to start it off. But this is where it starts kind of sloping and diminishing. And then Phase 5 is a freaking disaster, and I have no need to explain why. Everyone knows why.
I would probably do the same thing as you, except I would totally put Phase 1. I'd flip Phase 1 and 4. Okay. I personally, I suppose I haven't really played Final Fantasy 1, 2, or 3, so I would have to probably just back out of those. But I played all the others, believe it or not. I actually have. But I have played a little bit of 1, 2, and 3, and I'm not like super impressed by them. But maybe if I beat them all the way, I'd have more of an appreciation for them the way that you do, Mike. But
go ahead.
I was gonna say, in terms of like making an argument, like specifically with Phase 4, 11 is the most profitable Final Fantasy that I think they've ever made.
Yeah, it's also 10, my least favorite video game of all time, almost.
Yeah. 10 is, I think, the second highest selling Final Fantasy ever.
Yeah.
And then 12 is, I wouldn't say it's my favorite, I guess. It's up there, though. I like 7 and 9 better. But 12 is probably, and 6. 12 is probably my fourth favorite, up there with like 4 and 8, I guess. But it's really good. I think Phase 4 is still really strong, all things considered. There were still a lot of pieces in place that hadn't quite fallen apart yet after the merger. But, of course, eventually completely fell apart by Phase 5. So there you go.
Yeah, I think that those are good points. First of all, I guess I'll just clarify further. This is where the early signs of the sloping off began. It was like Final Fantasy 12 is trouble. Final Fantasy 12 is in my top 5. I think it's number 5 for me. I really like Final Fantasy 12, but there's just signs there that they don't quite got it like they used to, storytelling wise. And Final Fantasy X, not so much the story, but like world map construction, linearity, the way that they changed, like, taking away the joy of getting the airship for the first time and flying that around the world. You just kind of like pick a spot on a map and go there. There are certain things about the way that it was made that was like, again, kind of a sign of things to come that was losing just this portion of its spirit. that I felt kind of started
Sure.
with 10. But again, I still love 10 and I still love
Yeah.
12. I hate Final Fantasy 11. I legitimately hate that game. So that's just a personal thing for me. But I don't like MMOs. So
It's funny.
but it started sloping off there. And there are people saying that some they like phase 5, like 13 and 15 better than 1 through 3. I think in order to appreciate 1 through well, I don't want to say that. I'll say that I appreciate 1 through 3 a lot simply from the foundational perspective that I talked about before. But in addition to that, I legitimately have a lot of fun when I sit and play those games.
Really?
Like, despite the fact that, like, the encounter rate in Final Fantasy 2, you take like 2 steps, it's like, blah, fight again,
It's
blah,
freaking
fight again,
impossible.
blah, fight again, blah, fight again. Final Fantasy 2 is also considered by most people to be the very worst Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
I don't have that perspective. I understand why they think that.
You know what's kind of weird? In every phase, the middle entry is the worst one. Do you think that?
People will fight you about 5, but yes, generally that
But
tends
if it's
to be
up
the
against
case.
4 and 6, I'm sorry, 5 is less good than 4 and 6.
I
8
think
is
that's
good,
true.
but less good than 7 and 9. 11's less good than 10 and 12. Okay, now when we get to 13, 14, 15, I don't know.
14 is actually the best of those 3.
Yeah, 14 would actually be the best. But in each phase,
The
typically
whole
middle
thing's
one's
flipped
the
on
worst.
its head in phase 5. Tell you, phase 5 is crazy.
Phase 5,
But-
dude, they changed everything.
But yes, I would agree with that assessment. I
Yeah.
think that generally the middle of each of those trilogy phases is the weakest one.
Yeah. It's
Um,
like they started strong, they didn't quite know exactly what to do for the sequel, and then they finished strong after
Yes,
learning from their mistakes, I guess.
right. And each one of those was a console generation too.
Yeah.
So you have NES, Super NES, PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and then, it gets all
Well,
messed up after that. Again, phase
3
5.
and 4. Phase
fetching-
5, man.
Fetch phase 5. I hate phase 5.
Fetch those guys.
but no, I legitimately go. I like when I replay FF1 through 3. I play the original NES versions. I like those really outdated graphics, just with like the guy who's all red, the red warrior. I don't know. I like it, and I think part of it is because I have such a fondness for the NES.
Yeah.
Because it was a childhood console for me, and I get like a lot of people feel like the NES, they go back and play games and it's like, man, this just feels like it was not quite there. And then when they got to the Super Nintendo, like they really figured it out. The games felt better to play, control. They looked more presentable. The music was smoother. Like the presentation comes together. It feels better to play. Like the Super Nintendo, they figured it out, and the NES just feels clunky. I don't agree. I feel like the NES games were tighter in a lot of ways, animation-wise, because they used fewer frames. There's a really good video on this that talks about Mega Man, for instance. Mega Man, when they not remastered it, but they so you have the original Mega Man, NES Mega Mans, and then they did, I think, a version on Super Nintendo where you could play Mega Man 1, but on the Super Nintendo. They did a similar thing with the All-Stars version of Super Mario, where you could play Mario Brothers 1 through 3 on the Super Nintendo. Yeah. But like, no, fetch that. I'm not playing that version. I'm playing the NES version because it felt tighter. The animation felt tighter. I really like a lot of the sounds for the music that's created on the NES. I don't know. I have an affinity for that console that is not just nostalgia based. It is partly nostalgia based, but it's not just nostalgia based.
Sure.
That I think those games have a lot of merit in and of themselves, and I legitimately enjoy playing them, despite the fact that they are simpler, and they can be very unfair at times with encounter rates and instant death spells that wipe out your party with save points. But man, I just like them. I boot up Final Fantasy 1 and start playing that, and I feel happy. I boot up Final Fantasy 13, and I'm immediately angry. I'm upset. So I don't know. That's where I'm at. That's why I put it above. But okay. All right, guys. That's the end of our podcast. Thank you for watching. You guys are beasts. CapDoc says FF1 makes you feel like Spider-Man.
What?
We got donkey memes
Oh, there
in
you go.
here.
All right.
Okay. We love you guys. Thank you for watching. And we will see you again soon with a new video on the channel. I'm going to make something about the N64 this week. About why the N64 is such a great console. Why it's so beloved for me personally. And we'll see you again for next week's podcast. Have a good one. Peace out.
Peace.